The Man Who Broke the World. Linda Emery met Bruce Lee at a time when the world still didn't know what he would become. It was 1963, and she, a young physical education student in Seattle, was watching a martial arts demonstration in the gymnasium at the University of Washington. Among the precise strikes and piercing screams of the practitioners, one man stood out, thin but explosive, each movement an equation of strength and fluidity. He didn't fight, he danced with violence, transforming it into art. When their eyes met for the first time, Linda felt something she couldn't name. It wasn't just admiration. It was the weight of a presence that bowed to nothing, not even the rules of what was possible. Bruce smiled at her, a quick, almost imperceptible smile, as if he knew that moment had already been written. They married in 1964, in a simple ceremony, with few guests. At that time, Bruce was still a dreamer with a handful of students and a fighting method he called Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. Linda watched him train until his hands bled, until his muscles burned, until the sweat flowed as if it were part of his own breathing. He wasn't content with being good. "I wanted to be inevitable." "You don't understand," he told her, his dark eyes shining with an intensity that bordered on obsession. "Most people only see what's in front of them. I want to see beyond. I want my body to be a weapon, but also a poetry." Linda listened in silence, because she knew there were no words that could contain what he was. It wasn't just skill. It was a hunger. An absolute certainty that the world would have to bow to him, not the other way around. Then came the challenge. A traditional kung fu master, famous for his rigidity and disdain for Bruce's innovations, sought him out. "Your style is weak," said the man, with the tone of someone who had already decided the truth. "You're nothing but a showman." Bruce didn't argue. Just smiled. On the appointed day, a crowd gathered in the parking lot of the school where he taught. The master, a burly man with a stern expression, advanced with a slow, predictable punch. Bruce dodged with minimal movement, as if the air around him protected him. Then, in the blink of an eye, the man was on the ground, without understanding how. Linda watched the scene with her heart in her throat. It wasn't the first time she'd seen Bruce fight, but there, at that moment, she knew. There was no one like him. No opponent could touch him without him having already calculated every angle, every possibility. He wasn't fighting people, he was fighting the very concept of limits. The master stood up, humiliated, but Bruce didn't celebrate. He just extended his hand, helping him to stand up. "The fight is not about winning," he said, looking at the audience. "It's about understanding. And I still have a lot to understand." That night, while Bruce slept, Linda lay awake, watching him. He breathed slowly, as if even sleep were a form of training. She ran her fingers lightly over the scars on his knuckles, marks of a journey only he could take. He knew the world wasn't ready for him yet. And I also knew that one day I would be. Final chapter, Weight of the Dragon. The years passed like shadows over an empty ring. Bruce Lee became a legend before he even died, a ghost that wrestlers summoned on sleepless nights, a name that masters whispered to scare arrogant students. But fame did not fulfill him. On the contrary, the more the world called him invincible, the more he felt the weight of the armor he had forged. Linda was still at his side, but now there was a distance between them, as thin as a knife blade. She saw his eyes get lost in thoughts he didn't share, heard him muttering in Cantonese as he trained alone in the backyard, as if he were arguing with an invisible opponent. Once he woke up in the middle of the night and found him sitting on the edge of his bed, holding a handful of yellowed letters, letters from his father, from Ip Man, from old friends who had died or abandoned him. He burned them in the backyard at dawn, without saying a word. "Are you scared?" she asked one night, as he wrapped bandages around his hands before a demonstration. Bruce stopped. He looked at his own fingers, marked by decades of impact. "Fear is not the word," he replied. "It's like I've spent my whole life running towards a wall, and now that I'm close, I realize there's nothing on the other side. Just more room to run." Linda didn't understand. How could I? She hadn't spent her entire life being shaped into a weapon. The invitation arrived without warning, a challenge from a Japanese fighter, a man who had defeated every karate master in the country and now sought out the Chinese demon who had humiliated his compatriots years before. It wasn't an official fight, it was a duel in an abandoned warehouse in Hong Kong, broadcast only to a select group of sponsors and bettors. Bruce read the note 3 times before crumpling it up and throwing it in the trash. "You won't," said Linda, firmly. "I have no choice." "There is always a choice." He laughed, a dry, joyless sound. "You don't understand. If I refuse, they'll say I'm afraid. And if I'm afraid, everything I've built falls apart. People need to believe that I'm more than human. It's the only thing that keeps them safe." "What about you? Who keeps you safe?" Bruce didn't respond. That night, he dreamed about his father. The old man was sitting in a rocking chair, smoking a pipe, while Bruce, a child, was trying to punch a bag of sand. "You hit hard, but you don't hit right," said his father. "Force without direction is just noise." When he woke up, his right hand was throbbing, as if he had punched a wall. The warehouse smelled of mold and old sweat. The Japanese man, a man named Tanaka, was shorter than Bruce imagined, but his shoulders were as broad as tree trunks, and his eyes didn't blink. There were no presentations. There were no rules. Just the sound of feet scraping on concrete as the two approached. Tanaka attacked first, a spinning kick that Bruce dodged with ease. But something was wrong. The blow didn't have the cold precision of the fighters he'd faced before, it was savage, almost desperate, as if Tanaka was willing to break himself to break it. Bruce counterattacked with a series of blows that would have knocked out anyone else, but the Japanese absorbed each impact as if he were made of stone. Then Bruce saw it. Tanaka wasn't fighting him. He was fighting something inside himself, the same something Bruce recognized in his own nightmares. The anger, the shame, the fear of being forgotten. It was as if they were mirrored, 2 men trying to kill the same demon. In the 3rd round, Bruce stopped fighting. Tanaka hit him with a punch to the stomach that made him double over. He fell to his knees, tasting blood in his mouth. The Japanese raised his arm for the final blow, but hesitated. "Why don't you defend yourself?" he growled. Bruce spat blood onto the floor. "Because I already won." Tanaka frowned. "What are you talking about? You came here to defeat me. But the only thing that needs to be defeated is inside you." Bruce stood up slowly, legs shaking. "I've spent my whole life trying to be the best. But the best doesn't exist. There's only what you do with what you have." The Japanese lowered his fist. For a moment, he looked like he was going to cry. Instead, he turned and left the warehouse without looking back. Bruce returned home at dawn. Linda was awake, waiting. She didn't ask about the fight. Instead, he poured her a cup of tea and sat down next to her on the sofa. "I dreamed of you," she said. "You were in a ring, but there was no one there. Just you, dancing alone." Bruce took a sip of his tea. It was cold. Sometimes the hardest fight is against yourself. "And you won?" He looked down at his hands, now motionless. "I stopped fighting." Linda held his face in her hands. "Then maybe it's time to live." 2 months later, Bruce Lee died. There was no drama, there was no violence. Just a headache that started as a nuisance and ended with him lying on the bedroom floor while Linda screamed for help. Doctors said it was cerebral edema, a rare reaction to a painkiller he had taken. But the newspapers speculated poison, curse, the wrath of the gods he had defied. Linda buried him in Seattle, next to the son they had lost years before. At the funeral, there were hundreds of people, students, fans, strangers who had never met him but who felt they owed him something. She stood there, alone, as the coffin was lowered, and thought about all the times he had said he wasn't afraid of death. "Fear is not of death," he had once told her. "It's from not having lived long enough to deserve it." When the last shovelful of dirt fell onto the coffin, Linda smiled. Because, after all, the world was ready for him. And he was finally ready to rest. The last lesson. The next few months were a blur of paperwork, signatures, and decisions Linda wasn't prepared to make. The house in Seattle, full of books, notes and memories, seemed bigger without him. She had sold most of the furniture, leaving only the office intact, a time capsule of his ideas, scribbles on napkins, letters from readers he never responded to. Sometimes at night she would open a drawer at random and find a note. Linda, if I die before finishing the chapter on Norse myths, burn it all. Or better yet, publish it. The gods love a good polemic. She laughed, but the tears came later. The will was read in a cold office, with lawyers in suits and embarrassed looks. He had left her everything, except one thing. The Myths and Mysteries Foundation, which he had created years earlier to finance research into marginalized folklore and archaeology, would receive half of the royalties from his books. Lest the world forget that the most important stories are the ones no one wants to hear, the clause said. Linda didn't know how to manage it. He had never been the type to deal with numbers or bureaucracy. But, in the following weeks, while organizing his files, he found a notebook with notes about an unfinished project, The Last Storyteller. It was an idea for a book, or perhaps a manifesto, about how narratives shaped the world, and how, without them, humanity would be lost. People don't kill for land or money, he had written. They kill for stories. Because whoever controls the narrative, controls the truth. She took the notebook to the foundation and showed it to the directors. They were silent for a long moment. Then an older woman with tired eyes and a silver raven brooch said, he wanted this to be published. Not as a book. As a calling. The call. 6 months later, Linda stood in a packed auditorium in Reykjavik, in front of an audience of academics, writers, and onlookers. The event was part of a symposium on forbidden narratives, the power of myths in the age of misinformation. She hadn't planned to speak. But when the microphone was passed to her, the words came out on their own. My husband believed that stories were weapons, she said, holding the notebook to her chest. And that, at some point, someone would decide that some stories were too dangerous to tell. He died before finishing his. But he left a warning. If we don't fight for the stories that matter, someone will fight to erase them. The silence that followed was broken by a man at the back of the room, standing. And what do you suggest we do? He asked, with an accent that she couldn't identify. Linda took a deep breath. Start telling. Even the stories that scare. Even the ones that don't have heroes. Because, in the end, we are made up of what we remember. And if we let them erase the past, we won't have a future. The legacy. In the following years, the Myths and Mysteries Foundation became a refuge for persecuted researchers, censored writers, and archaeologists who challenged official versions of history. Linda has traveled the world, from villages in the Amazon to dusty libraries in Turkey, helping to preserve narratives that were being forgotten. She never wrote a book, but her talks and interviews spread like wildfire. One autumn afternoon, while walking through a cemetery in Edinburgh, she stopped in front of an ancient tombstone covered in moss. The inscription was almost faded, but she managed to read, "Here lies a storyteller. May his words never die." Linda smiled and placed her hand on the cold stone. "They won't," he murmured. And for the first time since he was gone, she believed it was true. The Last Storyteller. The biting Edinburgh wind carried the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves when Linda heard footsteps behind her. He didn't turn around. I knew he wasn't an ordinary visitor. The steps were very light, almost imperceptible, as if whoever was taking them didn't want to be noticed. But she felt the presence, a shadow that stretched across the tombstone, touching her fingers before it even reached her shoulder. "You're Linda Voss," said a hoarse voice, of someone who hadn't spoken in a long time. "The woman who collects stories that shouldn't exist." She finally turned around. Before her stood a thin man, wrapped in a threadbare overcoat, his deep-set eyes glowing with a feverish intensity. His face was marked by ancient scars, as if it had been carved by brutal hands. In his hands he held a worn leather notebook, the pages yellowed and filled with notes in cramped, almost illegible handwriting. "Who are you?" Linda asked, even though she already knew the answer. "My name doesn't matter." The man held out the notebook. "But this, yes. It belonged to the man who was buried here. He told me to give it to someone who understood. Someone who wouldn't let words die." Linda hesitated. I knew what that notebook represented, another forbidden narrative, another fragment of truth that someone had tried to erase. But I also knew that by accepting it, I would be signing a silent contract with danger. He had already lost friends, colleagues, even his mentor, because of secrets like that. "Why me?" he murmured. "Because you're the last one," he replied, and there was something final in his voice. "The last one who still believes that stories can change the world. Or destroy it." She took the notebook. The pages were cold, as if they still held the touch of the dead. When he opened it, he immediately recognized the writing. It was the same as a manuscript he had found years before in a clandestine library in Istanbul, a text that spoke of a secret society dating back to biblical times, a group that not only preserved stories, but controlled which ones were told. The manuscript was burned before she could fully translate it. But there, in that notebook, were the missing pages. And the name of the society, the Guardians of Silence. In the days that followed, Linda immersed herself in the notebook as if it were a portal. The notes revealed a network of power that spanned centuries, a brotherhood that decided which truths would be buried and which would be distorted to serve their interests. They had burned libraries, murdered historians, rewritten religions. And now, it seemed, they were after her. The first threat arrived by letter, left on his desk in the Foundation office. A single symbol scrawled in red ink, an eye inside a triangle, the same one that appeared in the notebook's margins. The message was clear: give back what doesn't belong to you. She didn't give it back. Instead, he called upon his few remaining allies, a retired NSA cryptographer, an investigative journalist who had survived 2 assassination attempts, and a former priest who had left the church after discovering that his bishop was part of the Guardians. Together, they deciphered the rest of the notebook and discovered something worse than they imagined. Society not only controlled narratives, but fabricated historical events. Wars, revolutions, even pandemics, all to keep humanity in a cycle of ignorance and fear. "They won't stop," said the ex-priest, looking at the map they had drawn, with red lines connecting points of power around the world. "If they find out that we know, they will eliminate us." Linda closed the notebook tightly. "Then let's make sure the whole world knows first." The operation was carried out in secret. Using the journalist's contacts, they gained access to a network of independent outlets, willing to publish the evidence without censorship. The cryptographer ensured that the files were encrypted and spread across servers in different countries, making it impossible to delete them all at once. And the former priest, with his network of contacts within the church, obtained documents that proved the Guardians' infiltration of religious institutions. But the Guardians were not fools. The day the first reports began circulating, Linda received a call. "You don't understand what you're doing," said a male voice, calm, almost fatherly. "These stories are not meant to be told. They break people. They make them question everything. And when people question, they stop obeying." "Maybe that's exactly what the world needs," Linda replied. There was a pause. Then, the man sighed. "You will die for this. All of you." The line went down. That night, as Linda was packing her things to leave Edinburgh and join the others in a safe location, the door to her flat was kicked down. There was no shouting, no fighting, just the sound of quick footsteps and a heavy object falling to the ground. When she turned around, she saw the former priest lying down, a dark stain spreading across his chest. Behind him, 2 men in dark suits, impassive faces, weapons drawn. "You should have returned the notebook," said one of them. Linda didn't run. He didn't beg. Instead, he smiled. You don't understand, do you? She lifted the notebook, now stained with the priest's blood. The stories are already out. And once they're loose, there's no way to put them back in the bottle. The man advanced. She closed her eyes. And then, the sound of gunshots. But they didn't come from men. They came from them. When Linda opened her eyes, the guardians were on the floor, and in the doorway, armed and breathing heavily, was the journalist, accompanied by a group of people she didn't recognize, men and women of all ages, some with scars, some with blank stares, but all with fierce determination. We heard, said the journalist, helping Linda to get up. All of us. And we won't let them silence us again. The following weeks were a whirlwind. The reports spread like wildfire. Governments fell. Churches were investigated. Banned books resurfaced. And at the center of it all, Linda Voss, the woman who collected stories, became a symbol. But she knew the battle wasn't over. The guardians were a hydra. You cut off one head, and two grew in its place. Still, for the first time in a long time, she felt something she thought she had lost forever: hope. On the last page of the notebook, the man buried in Edinburgh had written the sentence, underlined several times. Stories don't die. They just wait for someone brave enough to tell them. Linda closed her notebook and looked at the horizon. Somewhere, a new story was waiting to be found. And she would go after her.